Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Paul Casey. I'm the city administrator. Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you all very much for serving as well. I echo what the mayor says, that the city has a very rich tradition of being a board and commission type city. We've got over 40 boards and commissions, and so we really value the volunteer efforts of all your investment of time in that regard. But I want to go around and introduce everyone, except there's one new person that you all will interact with, and that's Sarah Gorman. She's our new city clerk in the back. And so she replaces Gwen Pierce, and she does a great job, but I think you all interact with her a lot, just kind of in your annual activities that you do as board and commission members. So what I want to do real briefly is kind of give you a little snapshot about what's going on in the city from kind of a global perspective, and then I'll turn it over to our city attorney, talk about some Brown Act issues. First, I think you're very aware that we are transitioning to a by-district form of electing our council members. And we started that this last November, where we elected our first 3 members by district: Jason Dominguez in District 1 on the east side, Randy Rouse in District 2 on the Mesa, and Kathy Murillo in District 3 on the west side. We're in this little transition period, like I said, because the other 3 council members are still finishing out their terms, having been elected at large. And so we'll have the remaining 3 district elections in November of 2017. That's also when the mayor will be up for election, and the mayor will continue to be elected at large. So we're kind of going through this, but within another year and a half, we'll be at district elections for all of our elected officials and the mayor at large. Department head team, just some quick announcements on changes over the last year. In the front row, you have Jill Zachary. I appointed her as Parks and Recreation Director. Jill's been with the city for over 18 years, but she takes over as director, so I'm very happy about that. Right in the middle is Pam Antill. She is the new Assistant City Administrator. Pam came from the city of San Jose and Palo Alto and other cities where she worked in similar type roles. So she kind of brings a fresh perspective and different way of looking at things. And to her right and sitting over here is Jessica Cadiente. She's our library manager, library director now. Jessica's only been with the city for a year. She was the city of Lompoc library director before coming to the city. And I appointed her, just like 6 months ago. It just seems like yesterday, but Jessica's doing a great job, so I appreciate that. And in the top is our acting police chief, John Krombach. He is helping out during the transition as I recruit for a new police chief, and he's doing a great job. He was the police chief down in the city of Oxnard, primarily prior to coming here. Real quick update on the police chief recruitment. It's going very well and getting near the end. We had 91 applicants in total. It was a very strong applicant pool. Narrowed it down to 6 finalists. We've already had some community panels interview the 6 finalists and make some recommendations to me. I've done follow-up one-on-one interviews and background checks and such, and I'm getting close to choosing a recommendation that I will then take to council. Police chief's a little different. They have to go through a background check. They have to do a psychological examination and a physical examination. So it takes about 3 or 4 weeks to kind of finish that process up, and to make sure nothing kind of shows up there that gives me any pause for thought. But I would hope within a month's time you'll see an announcement on a new police chief, and the quality of candidates I've been very pleased with, so I'm hopeful in that regard. Some key policy issues. You got to start with the drought. The drought is brutal. It's the worst drought on record. We're into year 5, and there's just nothing good to say about the drought. We were supposed to have the monster El Nino. A year ago, El Nino was going to be the biggest thing to ever hit, strongest on record. It's huge, it's surefire, there's no way you're going to miss. Northern California got a really good wet winter. The Sierras got a lot of snow. It missed Santa Barbara. We just missed out completely. We got half of our average rainfall. We didn't even hit our average rainfall with this El Nino. We got practically 0 runoff into our reservoirs. It rained, but it never rained in a concentrated enough manner to get that runoff to happen. So huge disappointment. We are going forward, though, with the desal plant. And that was a tough call about a year ago. With all that El Nino talk, for City Council to still go forward with the desal plant, I thought showed very good stewardship of the water system and a good approach, because we're really fortunate to have desal coming online this fall. So it's on track to come online. About $55 million to get 3,200 acre feet, but we're able to use the piping system and the plumbing that was already set up in place in the early 1990s, and it'll be up and running. Water conservation has been outstanding by the community, about 35% on average, which I think 5 years ago before the drought, we would have thought that would be really hard to ask of the community, but the community's really stepped up. Even the last month was 41% conservation. And the last thing I'll say about water, a little known hero in the water system, is in the early 90s, the voters voted for desal, but they also voted for state water. And it was somewhat controversial to get into state water because of the cost and also its reliability. And those criticisms are fair because the reliability of the state water system hasn't been great. But being tied into the system has been a real savior for us. It's allowed us to purchase water from other water entities and transfer it down here. And we've really been able to take advantage of that, and we're thankful to be able to have that option to do that with the drought. Homeless is an issue. We continue to try to address the homeless issue as best we can. It's just a challenging issue for us, for the state, for the region, for the nation. Council did adopt new regulations to address loitering and aggressive panhandling. We've implemented a number of those programs, especially in the Library Plaza, and really seen a dramatic improvement in the conditions at the Library Plaza. So that has worked out well. Council also voted in a new community service officer program. They're civilians. They wear kind of a formal uniform though, and they have some minor citation authority, but they're just kind of a physical presence and a comforting presence along State Street. And so I think that's been well received as well. Council's prepared to continue to fund that program as well. And then we're struggling with RVs. RVs is just a real tough policy issue. People sleeping in RVs, parking in neighborhoods, that sort of stuff. The ordinance committee is struggling with relooking at that issue. It's something you'll see us continue to try to grapple with. I wish there was an easy answer that was going to come out of that, and I'm not sure that easy answer is out there, but it's just one of the challenges you got to keep plugging away on. But vacation rentals is a piece of cake. Really easy to take care of that issue. So vacation rentals has become this huge issue over the last 5-6 years. It's not allowed in our zoning ordinance, but 7 years ago, no harm, no foul. And then it just became this monster that you couldn't contain. Got more and more neighbor complaints about vacation rentals next door and just different sleep patterns. And then the real impact on our housing. Housing has always been a top priority. We have a super low vacancy rate, and these vacation rentals are taking units off the market and running them as essential hotels. And so council last summer said, enough, let's enforce the existing ordinance. And so we're doing that now. I should say Ariel's mostly doing it now. And we're trying to gather the data, working with the planning staff and the city attorney to kind of start phasing them out. And I think you'll see some more people responding and getting out of the vacation rental business as we start notifying them more officially with letters saying it's illegal and getting compliance. And so probably take a couple years to kind of get that back under wraps. The average unit density program is controversial and very successful. So we had a general plan Santa Barbara. How do we get more rental? You haven't built rental in 40 years. Let's increase density. Let's limit parking and see if that works. It's really working. We're getting a lot of applications and a lot of activity, and that's creating some concern that maybe it's working too well, and we need to kind of dial it back a little bit. Council had another dialogue about that on Tuesday. So it's a program, it's a trial program. I think you'll continue to monitor it. I think you'll see council and the planning commission continue to kind of grind away and try to make that work for the city. On the good news, we are seeing rental housing being built for the first time. But as in Santa Barbara, we always got to keep looking at it closely and make sure it's working for us. So I think you'll see us doing that. A lot of construction down on Lower State Street in particular. A lot of projects all coming together at once in a way that's good, that we have 2 years of a lot of construction and then we're going to be done down there. Some quick pictures. State Street, the roadway improvements are almost done, so I think you'll see State Street reopened within about a month's time. And then you see the rest of the Entrada project really starting to come out of the ground. You're seeing it just start to take shape, even on a weekly basis. A lot of dramatic changes going on there. So Entrada is under construction. It's really going to happen. 123-room hotel. Some commercial space, some nice outdoor plazas, and a parking garage. The Children's Museum, the Wolf Museum of Exploration and Innovation on city-owned land that we're leasing them for $1 a year right by the railroad tracks. It's going to be a great museum. Really excited about that. They privately fundraised all the rest of the money for construction and the exhibits. The physical construction is just about done. It'll take them another 6 months or so to get all the exhibits in place. So I think by the beginning of 2017, that museum will be open. I think it's going to be a really nice addition to town. Mason Street Bridge, you don't see that, but over Mission Creek down there, it's almost done. Just the next month or two, I think it'll be back open. And then Cabrillo Boulevard is the one that causes a lot of the congestion down on the waterfront right now on Cabrillo. It's why we've had to narrow Cabrillo down to 1 lane in each direction. We're past the halfway mark, which is good. The mountainside is open, the sidewalks are done. We're now doing the construction on the ocean side. It'll take about another year to get through and get that important project done. There is a temporary bridge that just recently got put in to assist with the bike and pedestrian access around there. It's a really nice addition. I wish we could keep it. The Coastal Commission required it to be a temporary bridge, and so we're going to have to take it out after the construction's done, which I think is unfortunate because I think that would be a nice longer-term solution down there as well. Real quick on our financial condition. The general fund is doing okay, and you'll see why as I flip through these slides really quick. Sales tax growth has been good, but the last year or two it's kind of flattened out, and we've seen declines in sales tax for a couple quarters. I think part of that is the headwind of internet retail sales, just kind of chipping away at your sales tax revenue. So I think that will continue to kind of temper our sales tax growth. Bed tax has been stellar over the last 5 or 6 years, just outstanding growth in bed tax, and yet we've seen declines in 5 of the last 8 months in our bed tax growth, and so I think we're seeing a plateau on that growth. And then property tax over the last 3 years has kind of been muddling along. I think there's some potential for some growth there as properties that were reassessed during the recession kind of get back up to market level, but that's been tempered as well. Good news though, we've fully funded our reserves for the first time in 10 years. You can see this chart. Back in 2005, we dipped down to 2008 or 9 when we were about $10 million under our policy reserves, and then we've been chipping away at it. Council made it a priority in the last budget cycle, and we were able to get to fully funded reserves this past fiscal year, so that's good. So, draft budget that Council is grappling with right now, we had originally projected a $1.5 million surplus in this fiscal year. That disappeared with those revenues softening as you saw. And we've actually had to cut about $660,000 out of what was the second year of a 2-year budget. So in the scheme of things, that's okay, but I think it just kind of underscores kind of the softening and challenging environment we have going forward. And then I think wrapping up soon here with infrastructure. Continues to be a big discussion with the City Council. The Finance Committee has been looking every other week at the Finance Committee, looking at our streets infrastructure in particular and the lack of funding that we have to get at the capital program and our streets program, but then also looking at major facilities like the police building and fire stations and how do we grapple with this financial challenge. They're probably going to make some recommendations in the short term to shore up the streets fund a little bit, and I think they're also, quite frankly, looking at a revenue measure possibly in November 2017 to help get at these kind of insurmountable issues unless you really find some big ticket numbers. We need $8 to $12 million a year in our streets fund to really fund our streets program appropriately. We need $80 million for a police building that we really have to build and replace, and you just can't carve that out of our existing budget. So they'll be talking about that. And this just kind of talks about what's unfunded, fire stations, police stations, and that's, we've estimated about $400 million over a 20-year period is what we need to fund on an infrastructure. So that is a real quick snapshot, blowing through what's going on in the city. Happy to answer some quick questions before I turn it over to Ariel.
Good afternoon. My name's Ariel Kalan. I've been the city attorney here for about 2 years. Thank you. Like that? Okay, well that will be fun. I've been representing cities for about 33 years now, and there are some special things about Santa Barbara from a city attorney standpoint, and I want to try and emphasize those for you. We're going to do 3 things today. First, I want to give you kind of a mini civics lesson, which is really a pep talk I use on myself to stay into the game. Then I want to talk about 2 key public trust laws. By public trust, I mean they are ways that the public assures itself that we are trustworthy as their officials, and they are controls on what we do. The reason you care about these 2 public trust laws, besides your obligation and desire to be part of good government, is that they have criminal penalties if you violate them. So we do need to talk about that. Let's talk about the civics of it. There are about 500 cities in California. Fewer than 20% of those cities are called chartered cities. Santa Barbara is one of those 80 or so chartered cities in California. What does that mean? Well, there are 2 kinds of cities. Those other 420 cities are called general law cities, and what that means is that they only have the power that the state legislature in Sacramento gives them. They are creatures of the state. They have very limited powers in some ways. Chartered cities, on the other hand, like Santa Barbara, derive their power directly from the people. And they have power that is coextensive, just as broad as the power of the state, with respect to what's known as municipal affairs. So a city like Santa Barbara is empowered to do any kind of legislation, any kind of ordinance it wants to, so long as it's dealing with municipal affairs. That is an important distinction that you need to keep in mind. It means that we are blessed here, really, with the ability to make our community different in the ways we want it to be different. We are less controlled by Sacramento than the typical city in California. Now, how's that reflected? Our charter is built around the turn of the 20th century populist revolution concepts that renewed city government moving from the 19th to the 20th century. Examples: city council elections in Santa Barbara and throughout California are nonpartisan. You don't have Democrats on the ticket, you don't have Republicans on the ticket. The reason for that, among others, was to eliminate patronage, hiring, and firing. In the old days, when the new mayor came in, City Hall would be wiped out and the mayor's cronies would be brought in. We don't do that here. The model created at the turn of the 20th century was really designed to emulate a corporate structure. And it does that by having a city administrator who is effectively the CEO and a city council that is effectively the board of directors. So that power structure is really critical when you're looking at how your job fits in. Now, our charter is unusual. I won't say it's unique, but it's unusual. Many cities have what they call a city manager, and that is a clear representation of the strong CEO model. Santa Barbara has a title here called a city administrator. Now, for the most part, Paul's powers are coextensive with typical city managers. But in a city administrator form of government, boards and commissions and/or the council have some responsibility for the operations of the city's business. In other words, they have an administrative role that they wouldn't have in another kind of city. What do I mean by that? I'll give you an example from the charter. Our Fire and Police Commission has a limited role, but it does have a role in identifying who the police chief will be. That is a business function of the city. That is typically the power of the chief executive to make that kind of decision. In Santa Barbara, though, Fire and Police has a voice in that. So does the city council. Any department head in Santa Barbara has to be approved by the city council. So what that means is that the people, when they created our charter and designed government in Santa Barbara, were trying to assure that these boards and commissions and city council had a very strong role in how the community works. That is different. If I can get across anything today, I want you to understand that your role, your power, your voice as a board and commission member is very different from the typical city in California. Now, why is that? Why was that structured? Some of you who have lived elsewhere or have worked in government or even in the private sector may have heard the term civic engagement. And typically in cities, the city council will get an idea, go off and do it, and then the staff will be directed to really round up the public and bring them in and get their ideas. So civic engagement in a lot of cities is kind of an afterthought to developing city policy. Here it is built into the charter. Many of your boards and commissions, and this is unusual, very unusual, many of your boards and commissions are required by the city charter. And why is that? The people who wrote that charter saw ahead and wanted to make sure that the voices of the people represented by you were heard during the administrative processes of the city. So your role is very unusual and very powerful. You've got a strong voice in how the city develops policy. The mayor in Santa Barbara has limited executive powers. In other words, in some cities, in some administrative type cities, the mayor may have the authority to hire and fire, or to appoint certain department heads, or to present a budget. Here, the mayor serves as the executive of the city council and is responsible with the orderly operation of the city government through the city council. Our charter also has unusual language that gives the mayor the authority to interpret the laws and policies of the city to the community. I view that as a grant of power to do some interpretive work and to play a much more than a figurehead role with the community, but an active role in representing the policies of the city. So it is a communicative role, and it is a managerial role insofar as the city council goes. Okay, why does that all matter? Well, the power, this broad power that you've been given by the people through the charter to represent the community, to be the leading edge of civic engagement in Santa Barbara, has to be done in a way that maintains the public trust I mentioned at the outset. So we've got two bodies of law that we will get to once we fix the projector. And those two bodies of law deal with two broad subject areas that, again, you may have criminal responsibility for, so I want you to know about them. The first is the state's open meeting law, and that governs how you give your advice and make your decisions in public. The second body of law is an initiative called the Political Reform Act of 1974, and that initiative was designed to monitor and check the influence of money in your decision making, financial interests. So many of you may have already confronted the duty that you have to disclose your financial interests when you assume office and annually. There's a reason for that that we'll talk about. Okay, let's talk about the Brown Act, the open meeting law. The fundamental purpose of the Brown Act is, and this is a quote, it's to allow the people to retain control over the elements of government that they have created. The law says that the people do not give the government the power to decide what is good for the people to know or not to know. That is their right. So our decision-making processes, the decision-making processes that you're going to participate in when you're making policy or giving advice, are meant to be open and public. And the reason, again, is so that we can maintain the public trust with the community as we make our decisions. Now, the law gets there through a number of pretty technical rules, and I'm going to shorten them without the slide, so I'll try and talk you through it. The first thing is that your actions are limited to times when you're engaged in a lawful meeting, okay? So meetings, what are meetings? Meetings occur when a majority of your board or commission gather together in the same time and same place. You show up at your room in City Hall or wherever you happen to meet, Gebhardt Room, a majority of you are there, that is a meeting. And your business is to be transacted during that period of time and in that place. The Brown Act then goes on to describe a series of illegal meetings. And the illegal meetings happen when we accidentally or intentionally, if you're ill-advised or trying to pull a fast one, when the illegal meetings happen when a majority of you get together, not in the same time, not in the same place, but nonetheless communicate about city business in a way that effectively decides it. So how can that happen? What am I talking about? Email. If a majority of your board or commission starts trading emails about how you want to do something, what ability does the public have to see those emails? Basically none. And if you communicate substantial information among a majority of you, or if you make a decision via email, it's a violation of the Brown Act and it can be a misdemeanor. We have received warning letters from the district attorney on occasion. At one time, we had a council member who inadvertently hit reply all, okay? And that ended up in the DA's lap. We received a warning letter. I wrote back nicely to the DA, explained why she was wrong, but said sorry, okay? Why? I don't want my clients to be charged with a misdemeanor for violating the Brown Act. So email is a big way that violations happen now. It doesn't have to be just email. It can be any medium. In some cities, there are big problems going on with Facebook. Members of boards and commissions or councils insist on posting on each other's walls or pages, however you want to think of it, on Facebook. If a majority of you trade thoughts on Facebook, that can be a violation of the Brown Act. And what's worse, perhaps, is that while it kind of feels open and public, everybody can see it, or most people can see it, so can the DA. So you're approving the violation in real time when you exchange ideas or information about city business on Facebook or through email. Does it have to be technological? No. As far as the law is concerned, it could be a stone tablet passed among you, okay? Notes passed during a meeting. There's actually a case in the California Supreme Court right now coming out of the city of San Jose where the question in front of the court is whether text messages and emails on private accounts, think Hillary Clinton for a second, and I'm not saying that pejoratively, I'm saying that the context the court is dealing with this currently is very a la mode politically because of the Clinton situation with a private email server. Anyway, the California Supreme Court is now trying to decide whether your private messages, texts, emails on private servers are subject to the state's open records law if they're about city business. So what we're seeing is that the open meeting law and the open records law are evolving to address technology. There's no hiding place. What do you do about that? You confine your discussion about city business to those meetings where you're all in the same time and same place. All right? Now, how does the public know what you're going to talk about at a meeting? How do we inform the public so that they can show up if they're interested? The law requires a written agenda to be posted 72 hours before your regular meetings. And that agenda both describes and limits what you can talk about during your meetings. So you don't have the freedom to show up at a meeting and in kind of free-form style talk about any subject that pops into your head. You are limited by that agenda. And each of the boards and commissions has a different process with their staff liaison for how items get put on the agenda. And you'll need to talk to your staff about that. But again, this agenda posted 72 hours before a regular meeting is there to let the public know what you're doing and to make them feel comfortable that if they are interested in what you're doing, they can show up, and that if they don't show up, you're not going to talk about something they were interested in. There are some limited exceptions where you can talk about urgent business that's come up. Probably won't happen for a board or commission. If that does happen, if within 72 hours of a meeting something urgent comes up that you want to talk about, get in touch with your staff liaison. They'll get in touch with our office and we'll advise whether that can be added to the agenda. Deborah?
Given our society is so technology intensive, do you have any guidance for the decision makers appointed in elected I see that in our city, I see those uses, and I didn't know if you're gonna be coming out with guidance on that.
There are two areas where that comes up, Deborah, and that is the council's addressed one of those with its policy regarding personal devices, phones, texts. The council is not permitting itself to receive or exchange messages about the subject of a hearing during a hearing. Why? It's unfair to the people who are there who are trying to represent themselves. That's one context where a fundamental fairness, due process, if you will, makes it unfair for the council to get secret information during a hearing. The other context it comes up is kind of a surprise. There's a famous case out of Los Angeles where the city council was obviously not paying attention to what was going on in the hearing. They were distracted with electronic devices, they were talking amongst themselves, and the allegation was that the people involved in that meeting were denied a fair hearing because the people doing the hearing weren't listening, right? We talk about public hearings, we don't talk about public listenings. Maybe we ought to change that. At a public hearing, I want you to listen. So yeah, there are two technology contexts where it can be an issue. I sit there with a computer open at the meeting so I can do my research, but I'm not making a decision. I wouldn't counsel the city council or your board and commissions to be engaged in communications about what you're working on during a meeting. Okay?
Can I ask you to clarify something though?
Sure.
Because some are using laptops, some are clearly using laptops. We won't debate what the laptops are being used for, but I guess it's the perception issue, and we get trained on this in AB 1234. We see cases where there's been just a perceived bias by the public of the decision maker that's led to various actions just by having a laptop up. But this is, I want to say, a paperless age. We're trying to move to the extent we can in that direction, and yet nobody knows what's actually occurring on the laptop or the other personal device. So
Right now, the law doesn't explicitly deal with that perception problem. AB 1234 or 1234 came about 12 years ago, 2004 or so, and it requires public officials every couple of years to get very extensive ethics training. So I mentioned that the agenda has to go up 72 hours before a regular meeting. You can also have special meetings with a notice posted only 24 hours before, okay? Your staff will be responsible for that. So if, again, something urgent comes up and your input is needed, you may be called to show up on 24 hours notice. Now, there are rules about how those meetings are called so that they aren't done in a way that cuts out part of the board or commission, all right? But you shouldn't need to worry about that. The staff will cover that. So we've talked about your meetings being open and public. They happen when a majority of you are in the same time and same place discussing city business. They're not supposed to happen when you're not in the same time and place via email or Facebook or whatever medium. And the meeting has to be preceded by an agenda that notifies the world what you're going to be talking about. Okay? So notice meetings. There are some exceptions to the Brown Act that are designed to recognize the reality of local government. Okay? And that reality is that we are accountable to the public. The council has constituents who elected them. They want to talk to the council. They want to lobby the council. That is okay. Other than public hearings where you are deciding the property rights of someone, and that comes up rarely for most of your boards and commissions. It comes up frequently for the Planning Commission. They're often deciding property rights. Sometimes the Fire and Police Commission will decide whether a towing permit gets revoked or not. That's a property right. But if you're not talking about a property right, you're probably talking about what we'd call a legislative matter. And on a legislative matter, it's okay for the public to lobby you in private. What it's not okay for the public to do is tell you how a majority of your colleagues are going to vote. That's the same as email or Facebook. So if you are asked to meet with an individual about some city business, and it's not a situation where you're deciding the rights of an individual with respect to property, you can have that meeting if you want to, but you can't talk about what your colleagues are going to do. And you cannot let that person act as an intermediary amongst you to tell each other what you're going to do. All right, so that's an exception. You're allowed to be lobbied individually. You're also allowed to go to open community events that are where the public has been notified they're happening. So this would be a neighborhood association meeting. A majority of you can be in the same time and place at a neighborhood association meeting, provided that you don't talk about city business on the side of the room, okay? So the law, again, in trying to recognize the reality of your relationship with your constituents, allows you to go to a neighborhood meeting, all of you, if you want to go to a neighborhood meeting. So those are two important exceptions. There are exceptions in the Brown Act that allow a majority of you to participate in a social or ceremonial occasion. You can show up at a birthday party, even though there's no agenda, a majority of you can be there. Again, you can't talk about city business. Now, we've talked about notice for meetings, we've talked about meetings, we've talked about exceptions to the rules for meetings. There are a few other pieces of the Brown Act that I want you to know about. Emails that you receive from the public or anyone that go to a majority of you are public records. And in the case of the City Council, what we've asked the council to do is when they get an email that from the face of the email you can see it was sent to a majority of your colleagues, so the to line or the CC line shows that it went to a majority, we've asked the council to forward those to either the city administrator or city clerk to retain those records and make them available to the public. You have the same obligation. The point there is not to prevent you from communicating with the public. It is to make sure that all the public knows what information you're basing your decision making on and who is giving it to you. So if you get emails, if a majority of you get an email, send it to your staff representative so they can make it public as well. This is important because honestly, in my career, more often than not, the staff does not get a copy of those communications. The people doing that direct communication with the decision makers really don't want staff to know what's going on. And that's a problem administratively. Some cities have created electronic databases so they can be looked at over the web. We're not there yet. What happens is if somebody requests that information, we'll produce it. So we're not pushing it out there like we could be. All right. Okay, we've talked about agendas, meetings, exceptions to meetings. We have talked about emails. There are very few times when you can meet in secret. I use the word secret advisedly. It is loaded. The newspapers hate secret meetings. But the Brown Act allows them using a term called closed sessions. There are limited opportunities for your boards and commissions to meet in secret. And it's not to save people embarrassment. A lot of decision makers say, geez, this is a sensitive topic. I don't want to hurt somebody's feelings. So we want to meet in secret to talk about it. The Brown Act doesn't care about that. That's not legal. There are basically 3 times that you can meet, or 3 situations in which you can meet in closed session. To discuss litigation, very rare for boards and commissions. To discuss personnel or personnel evaluations, again, very rare for boards and commissions. Notable exception, fire and police talking to the city administrator about appointment of the police chief. The third category is real estate negotiations. The law does recognize that the public should not be put at a disadvantage when it is trying to buy or sell real estate. So we're allowed to get limited direction the law says direction on the price and terms of payment for real estate. Now that exception is closely watched, and we are very cautious about it at City Hall. Why is it closely watched? A number of bigger cities, San Diego, Oakland in particular, have misused that real estate exception to discuss stadium deals. And in the case of Oakland, or Alameda, I should say Alameda County, the stadium deal resulted in hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayer liability, and it was all done in secret. So you get the sense that operating in secret is disfavored. That's right. And the reason is there's a great potential for bad things to happen at the public's expense if they're not watching us. Some cities, take Bell. You remember Bell? Bell was operating in secret. The city manager there was operating way outside his range of lawful authority, paying himself a fortune, paying his staff a fortune, and the public completely lost control there. So we actually have an amendment in the Brown Act that is responsive to Bell. It won't come up for you, but I'll mention it because it's interesting. The city council is not allowed to establish a salary for the city administrator or department heads in special meetings. So you can never establish salary on only 24 hours notice. You have to do it on 72 hours notice so that the taxpayers can make sure the government is doing the right thing. So that's kind of a shortened version of the Brown Act. I will work with the city clerk's office to have the PowerPoint emailed to you guys as PDFs so you can go through it. I want you to feel free to call, ask me questions. Let me give you my number. It's 564-5326. I'm happy to talk about this subject matter, and we get quite a few questions from staff.
Could you repeat that?
Sure. 564-5326. And my email is this is City Standard Convention, ACALONNE, ACALONNE, at the Santa Barbara address. Okay. We know that open meetings are there so the public can monitor what we're doing. The public also has a right to know about our money interests, the financial interests that could influence us. So in 1974, an initiative passed called the Political Reform Act. And the Political Reform Act addressed two broad subject areas. It addressed financial conflicts of interest, which we're going to talk about. It also addressed campaign finance reform and campaign rules. We're not going to talk about that. I don't give political advice to the city council. I don't tell them how to run their campaigns. That's not my role. I don't take any role, nor do any of the city staff, in helping the council members achieve political objectives. We help them achieve their policy objectives, but we're not there to support their effort to stay in office. Likewise, unrelated to political reform, but you ought to know it, the city can't spend public money to support a ballot measure. So Paul mentioned that $400 million of infrastructure demand. We can't take out ads. We can't run a PR campaign to support, let's say, a tax measure. That has to come up from the grassroots of the community to lead that kind of campaign. And again, the purpose is to depoliticize what we do. So let's talk about political reform. The basic rule in the Political Reform Act calls for two kinds of things: disclosure of your finances and disqualification of your ability to make decisions when your finances are involved. We're only dealing with finances here. So the basic rule of the Political Reform Act says that no public official can make or participate in making a decision in which they know they have a financial interest. All right? So if you're going to vote on something that's going to affect you financially, you can't do it. And not only can you not do it, you have to tell the public that you can't do it, and you have to tell them what the financial interest is. For most of us, that is our home. It usually comes up with our home. There's an odd nuance in the Political Reform Act. You don't have to report your home on the annual statement that you turn in, but you do have to count your home or your leasehold if you're not a home owner. Your leasehold rental agreement can create a conflict of interest for you. So that's a biggie I want to call out because that happens most often. But there are other kinds of financial interests that you need to be aware of. And what I want you to really do is be responsible for thinking about which financial interests you have that might be affected by a city decision you're involved in. I don't think that you have the obligation to figure out whether it's lawful for you to vote or not. There are two ways for you to get that kind of help. One is to call me. We provide advice, but even better, you get immunity from prosecution under state law if you call the Fair Political Practices Commission 1-866-ASK, ASK, FPPC. If you present a request for advice to them, they'll require you to send a letter, but you can start with a phone call. If you present a request for advice and they advise you, that protects you against prosecution, essentially, okay? Now, I said that the rule is no public official can make or participate in making a decision in which they have a financial interest. What does that mean? Make or participate in making clearly means more than just voting on something, all right? If you've got a financial interest and you can't participate in the vote, you also can't lobby staff, lobby your fellow board and commission members. All you can do is in limited circumstances, if your personal interest is affected by the decision, you can come as a member of the public and present your concerns to your board or commission. All right? So if you do have a financial interest that's affected, that means no participation whatsoever. Let's talk now about the kinds of financial interests the law cares about. I mentioned real property. Typically it's your home or rental. It can be any real property you own or lease. So it could be your business. Let's say you lease a commercial space. That could be a piece of real property or real property interest that you need to be concerned with. It could be property that you have a limited partnership involvement with. So think very broadly when you're thinking about your financial interests. So real estate. Number two is investments. Investments usually mean stocks. For most of us, that's what it means. And the threshold is a $2,000 investment. If you've got a $2,000 investment in a particular company, and that company is before the city for some kind of decision, you can't participate. Now that's a gross oversimplification of the rule, but it's enough to highlight when you need to be concerned. Mutual funds are not covered by the Political Reform Act. Why? You don't control the decision making over what the mutual fund invests in. Okay, so I'm talking about individual stocks here. I was going to say, heaven forbid you own Chick-fil-A stock and we're involved in that situation on upper state. So we've talked about real estate, we've talked about investments. Loans are also an issue. You have heard about shady deals where state legislators are getting loans from financially interested people who want legislation to go a certain way. If you are the recipient of a loan, the lender, that person or entity that is the lender, can be a financial interest that you have to think about. So now we've moved from real estate to stock to people. People in the form of lenders, and also the next category is people or entities that are sources of income to you. Anyone who has paid you more than $500 in the preceding 12 months is a source of income that can become a financial interest and create a conflict of interest for you. So it's pretty simple. You work for a company, let's say it's a sole proprietorship and you're an employee. The boss of that company, your boss, comes before your board or commission. You've got a source of income in front of you. You can't make a decision. Why? The law presumes that you will be pressured one way or another to make a decision. A lot of times people ask, doesn't it help if I vote against my own interest? You know, I'm going to prove that I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to vote to hurt my financial interest. It doesn't help. The law doesn't care whether it's beneficial or negative. All that matters is that financial interest is there. Real estate, investments, we said stocks, loans, sources of income. The other biggie is gifts. People who are donors, the source of gifts to you. Currently, the state law has a fixed limit on the amount of any gift you can take. That limit is $460. But the law requires you to report any gift $50 or greater. Okay? So that is also a cumulative number. How does this play out? You go to lunch 2 or 3 times with somebody who has business before your board or commission. They pick up the tab. You're going to end up having to report that gift. There are rules that extend, because of lobbyists in Sacramento, there are rules that extend the concept of gifts to what we'd call in-home hospitality. So that there isn't cash changing hands may not make a difference. If you are receiving something of value from someone who has business before the city, you've got a potential issue. In my office, we accept no gratuities. That is, I know, is the city administrator's policy as well. So we are invited often to lunch by people who have business before the city. I know they're not doing it because they like me, you know? They're doing it because I've got something to offer. And I'm not interested in offering it for the price of a lunch, all right? I may have a price, but it's not a lunch. Okay, so we talked about real estate, investments, loans, sources of income, gifts. There's another category of gifts that gets some special treatment, and it comes up pretty often around here. It is gifts of tickets to events. A lot of times city officials are offered comp tickets to various events. Sometimes you can do that, sometimes you can't. My only point here is to highlight that if you get comp tickets to, I don't know, some event at Fiesta, think about whether that's a gift, call the FPPC or call my office. It's a significant issue. And the FPPC, the Fair Political Practices Commission, has spent a lot of time trying to make those rules realistic so that you can go to some kinds of nonprofit events. But they also get to be very complicated, where you might be allowed to attend the event for free, but the value of the meal or any other gratuity at the event is reportable as a gift. So they're complicated rules. The last category of financial interest is called the personal financial effect rule. And what it really is a catch-all that the Fair Political Practices Commission uses to find a conflict of interest when all else fails. And it basically says that if your personal finances are affected by $250 or more in the year, you may have a financial conflict of interest. How can this come up? We don't let, for example, the city council members who have slip permits down at the harbor, they're not allowed to vote on what the harbor charges for a slip. That might be a pretty small amount of money. It'd certainly be less than $2,000, the increase or decrease in those charges, but it would certainly be within that $250 personal financial effects rule. Now, there's a broad exception to all of this that I want you to be aware of too, and I want you to be aware of it so you don't think something's going on in a shady way at City Hall. There is a broad exception to the Political Reform Act for actions that affect you in the same manner as they affect the public generally. Okay? If the city is taking an action that affects everybody in town, it's okay if the council is affected the same way as everybody in town. That typically comes up with water rates. How could a city ever pass water rates if the city council had a conflict because they were increasing their financial burden? So it's very practical. It is very technical as well. So if you have a generally applicable kind of issue, it might be, let's say it's a zoning ordinance that's going to apply citywide, or a change in the general plan if you're on the planning commission. Talk to us. There is a quantitative analysis of how many people have to be affected or how many businesses have to be affected. I'll give you an example, and none of this stuff is secret, by the way. The advice I give the city council or you is open and public. I don't have a confidential attorney-client privileged relationship with individual council members on conflict of interest or with you as individuals. My ethical obligation runs to the corporate entity, to the city. What that translates to, the example, Randy Rouse, he's got a restaurant, right? The ordinance committee is considering regulations that we've offered to update the city's rules on commercial trucks parking, food trucks, trucks that are selling housewares, that kind of stuff. Our rules on that are 20 plus years out of date, meaning there was case law a long time ago that said what Santa Barbara had on the books forbidding those kinds of trucks are no longer enforceable. Well, the question is whether a law that would impact food trucks would specially benefit or harm Randy's restaurant. We have a request for advice in with the with the Fair Political Practices Commission right now to determine that. Would a significant segment of the public likewise be affected in the same manner as Randy? I don't know. It depends on how many restaurants there are in town. It depends on how localized the effect of this regulation is. Why that one's a hard problem is that the proposal in front of the ordinance committee would create special rules for the Pueblo, for the old part of downtown. There would be tighter rules restricting hot trucks and commercial trucks from parking. So that's the way that particular issue, this exception for things that affect the public generally, comes up. It's not always intuitive. I want to make one last special mention for sole practitioners in a design type of profession. So we're talking ABR, Architectural Board of Review, HLC, Planning Commission, Single Family Design Board. You remember at the outset I said that making or participating in making the decision means that you can't talk to staff, you can't talk to your colleagues. Well, what do you do if you have a client with business before the city? Are you not allowed to take that business? The answer is that if you are a sole proprietor, in limited circumstances, you can represent that client before your own board or commission. It's very limited. It's design professionals. I want you to know it's out there so you'll ask for advice. I'm not going to go into the nuances of it. That is really the broad overview. I'll close on political reform by again saying call that 866 Ask FPPC number if you've got any questions, both when you're filling out your Form 700 and during your business dealings on behalf of the city. I'm going to talk about one last piece of conflict of interest law just to make you aware of it. But before I get there, most of the fines that the FPPC hands out are not because people made a decision in which they had a conflict of interest. They are because a person failed to file their forms on time. Those deadlines are mandatory. It's April 1 for the annual Statement of Economic Interests. There is no latitude in most circumstances, and you have to get fined if you're late. So don't be late. There's a trick there. There are two other kinds of forms you have to fill out. One when you assume office, one when you leave office. So if you leave in a huff, don't think you're just going to say, hell no, I'm not going to file that form. You will be tracked down by the FPPC and you will be fined, I promise. I promise. Okay, the last bit of law is a weird little conflict law that is just worth mentioning in passing. It's called Government Code 1090. And it says that no public official can be financially interested in a contract made by their agency. All right? I don't know, most of you probably read the Indy. Just recently, a former employee of City College, he was giving contracts to his husband, and he was charged with a misdemeanor violation of Government Code 1090. Long story short, you cannot, as a public official, be on both ends of a transaction with your agency. The other celebrated case, you remember Bill Honig, the state superintendent of schools? He was feeding contracts to a nonprofit that his wife ran, all right? It's a felony violation. You're banned forever from holding office. It's very serious. The good news is that 2 years ago, the legislature authorized the FPPC, the Fair Political Practices Commission, to give advice on Government Code 1090. So you can also get advice from them on that question. It will typically come up when you have a spouse or an immediate relative who is wanting to do business with the city. You're going to recognize, you're not going to get in, we're not going to let you get into a contract with the city. We see that one coming. The ones we don't see coming as administrative staff are the contracts that involve family members or spouses, okay? So that's kind of a nutshell of what you need to be concerned with, but we're running out of time. But you don't have to, okay? All right, thank you very much.